This story is based on real historical records, survivor testimonies, and documented wartime archives.
They measured me twice before they wrote anything down. I was 5 feet, 4 inches, 112 pounds. The sergeant with the clipboard looked at the number, then looked at me, then wrote something in the margin that I never got to read. I was below the minimum requirement for military service. Too small, too light. In peacetime, that would have meant a deferment and a handshake. But this was October 1943, and peacetime had been a long time ago. They needed warm bodies. They found mine. 3 weeks later, I was standing on a frozen runway in East Anglia, England, looking up at a B-17 flying fortress for the first time. She was enormous. 4 engines, each bigger than my mother's kitchen. The fuselage alone was longer than the main street of the town I grew up in. 65 feet of aluminum and steel and rivets, and somewhere underneath her belly, there was a glass sphere the size of a small bathtub. That sphere was going to be my home for the next 8 months. My office, my confessional, the place I would do my work and say my prayers and try, with everything I had, to be alive at the end of it. The ball turret, that is what they called it. Officially, the Sperry A2 lower ball turret. The men called it other things. The fishbowl, the suicide seat, the coffin. It was a sphere of aluminum and plexiglass, 32 inches in diameter, bolted to the underside of the aircraft. Inside, a man would sit with his knees drawn up to his chest, his back curved like a question mark, his feet positioned beside twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns. He would be facing the Earth. 6 miles below the Earth, to be specific. When the ball rotated, and it rotated almost 360 degrees, the man inside it rotated with it. There was a hydraulic motor to control the movement, joystick controls for elevation and azimuth, a reflector sight positioned directly between the gunner's eyes and the void ahead. The turret was designed to defend the bomber from fighter attacks coming from below. The thing it was not designed for was a man of average size. That was the first rule of the ball turret. You had to be small, under 5 feet 6, ideally under 5'4", under 150 pounds. In the pre-war army, that body type meant rejection. In the 8th Air Force in late 1943, it meant a very specific assignment. I was assigned to the ball turret because there was no one else on my crew small enough to fit. That is the honest truth of it. There was no aptitude test that identified me as the ideal candidate. No evaluation of my spatial reasoning, or my reflexes, or my ability to tolerate enclosed spaces. The crew chief looked at the 10 of us standing on the tarmac, asked us to line up by height, and pointed at the 3 shortest men. The other 2 were assigned to waist gun positions. I was the smallest, so I got the ball. I remember my first time climbing into it. They walked me underneath the fuselage, showed me the access hatch, a small oval opening in the bottom of the turret, about the size of a car window. I had to lower myself in, feet first, then curl my body around the guns and draw my knees toward my chest. The hatch closed behind me. The sound of it latching was very particular, a solid metallic click that I heard in my sleep for years afterward. Inside, the space was exactly as small as it looked from the outside. My elbows were against the gun breeches. My oxygen mask was 6 inches from the plexiglass window. Above me, or below me, depending on how you measure when you're curled inside a sphere, was the entire sky. The first thing I thought was, there is no room for a parachute in here. The second thing I thought was, I should not have thought that. The parachute issue was real, and it was something every ball turret gunner understood from the first day. The standard chest parachute was too large to fit inside the turret with you. You left it outside, clipped to a bracket just beyond the access hatch. If the aircraft took fire and the order came to bail out, the procedure was rotate the turret to the exit position, unlock the hatch, climb out into the fuselage, retrieve your parachute, put it on, reach the nearest exit, and jump. In a perfectly functioning aircraft with no fire and no structural damage, this took approximately 30 to 45 seconds. In the real world of a damaged, burning B-17 at 25,000 feet, with the aircraft in an uncontrolled attitude, it took however long God decided to give you. Some men had exactly that time. Some had less. There were also belly landings to think about. If the landing gear was damaged and the pilot had to bring the aircraft in on her belly, the ball turret, positioned at the lowest point of the fuselage, would make contact with the runway first. The turret could be retracted into the aircraft before landing, but this required electrical power and a functioning hydraulic system. If the aircraft had taken enough damage to lose its landing gear, there was a reasonable chance it had also lost other things. The men who designed the B-17 understood this problem. They left the solution to the men who flew it. I have been asked many times since the war whether I thought about these things during the missions. The honest answer is yes and no. You thought about them beforehand, in the barracks the night before, in the briefing room at 4 in the morning when the curtain came off the map and you saw the red thread running deep into Germany. You thought about them very specifically, in a practical way, the way an engineer thinks about a structural problem. You catalogued the risks, you reviewed the procedures, you told yourself the procedures would work if you stayed calm. Then you climbed into the ball, the hatch clicked shut, and you stopped thinking about the procedures. There was no room for that kind of thinking in there. There was only the sky, the guns, and the work. The work, in the fall of 1943, was killing. The 8th Air Force was conducting what was called the Combined Bomber Offensive. The theory behind it was elegant and, at the time, largely untested. Send waves of heavy bombers in daylight, in tight defensive formations, deep into German industrial territory, and destroy the factories that kept the Wehrmacht running. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft assembly facilities, oil refineries, synthetic fuel production. The bombers would fight their way in and fight their way out, protected by the overlapping fields of fire from their own guns. The theory had a significant flaw, which revealed itself slowly and then all at once through the summer and fall of 1943. The Luftwaffe adapted. They learned that a head-on attack against a B-17 formation, closing at combined speeds of 600 miles per hour, gave the bomber gunners almost no time to track and fire. They came in waves, 12 abreast, from 12 o'clock, cannons blazing. They developed specific tactics for dismantling a combat box formation from its edges inward, like stripping bark from a tree. They were very good at it. At its worst period, in late 1943, the statistical reality for an 8th Air Force bomber crew was this. To complete a tour of duty, you needed to survive 25 missions. The odds of surviving 25 missions, with the loss rates that existed in the autumn of that year, were approximately 1 in 3. The average B-17, not the crew, the aircraft itself, survived 11 missions before being shot down or damaged beyond repair. The 8th Air Force was losing men faster than it could replace them with adequately trained crews. These numbers were not shared with us directly, but we were not stupid, and we could count the empty beds. My group, the 381st Bomb Group, flew out of Ridgewell in Essex. We arrived in England in June 1943 and began operations almost immediately. By the time I joined them in October, the group had been through the August Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. 60 bombers lost in a single day, 600 men, and the losses had carved visible holes through the roster. New crews arrived to fill the gaps. Some of those new crews were gone before I had time to learn their names. The pre-mission routine began before dawn. A runner would come through the barracks, a hand on your shoulder, a low voice, "Mission today." You had an hour before briefing. In that hour, you dressed, ate what you could manage, and tried not to think about the map you were about to see. In the briefing room, folding chairs packed tight, cigarette smoke already layering the air at 4 in the morning, the intelligence officer would pull the curtain from the map, and the red thread would appear. If the thread stopped short, France, maybe Belgium, there would be a low exhalation of relief. If it ran east, all the way to a circle deep in German territory, the room went quiet in a particular way. Not silent, just quiet. On October 14, 1943, the thread ran to Schweinfurt. It was the second time the 8th Air Force had gone to Schweinfurt. The first time, in August, had been one of the worst days in 8th Air Force history. The ball-bearing factories there were considered a critical choke point in German war production. Destroy them, the thinking went, and you could strangle the Wehrmacht's ability to manufacture anything that moved. Tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, everything ran on ball bearings. The August mission had cost 60 bombers. The follow-up mission, October 14th, was supposed to finish the job. 291 B-17s took off that morning. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Once the escort fighters turned back at the limit of their range, somewhere over the German border, the bomber formations were alone against the full weight of the Luftwaffe. They came in from 12 o'clock, from 6 o'clock, from 3 and 9, in coordinated waves that never seemed to end. Some were firing rockets now, heavy unguided projectiles launched from beyond machine gun range, designed to break formations apart so the fighters could pick off the stragglers. I was in the ball. I am going to try to describe what it is like to be in the ball turret on a mission like that, because it is not something that can be understood from the outside. The turret rotates. When the threat is below and behind, you rotate back and down. When fighters come from ahead, you rotate forward. You are watching the sky through a plexiglass window the size of a dinner plate, and the sky is full of things that want to kill you. Tracers from the gunners ahead of you leave white streaks. Flak bursts appear and disappear, black flowers against blue sky, each one a small explosion that sends steel fragments in all directions. When flak is close, you feel the concussion through the turret's frame. A low thump, like a fist hitting the underside of the aircraft. You learn to read those thumps the way a ship's captain reads the behavior of water. From below, in the ball, you could see the bombers to your left and right, and if you rotated far enough forward, the ones ahead in the formation. When a bomber took a direct hit, you saw it. Sometimes it was sudden. One moment a B-17 flying in tight formation. The next moment an orange-white flash and pieces coming apart in every direction, a wing going one way, the tail going another, the burning fuselage beginning a long, slow rotation toward the Earth 6 miles below. Sometimes it was slower, a fire in an engine spreading to the wing, the aircraft falling out of formation, losing altitude, the crew trying to keep it flying long enough for 10 men to get out. You counted the parachutes. You tried to count them. 9 would mean someone didn't make it out. 8, 2 men. If you could see only a few white blossoms opening against the grey sky below, it meant most of the crew had gone down with the plane. You tried to keep counting, but you had your own aircraft to protect, and there were more fighters coming, and the intercom was crackling with voices from every position. What I remember most about the long missions is not the fear, though the fear was real and constant. What I remember most is the isolation. In the ball, you were physically separated from the rest of your crew. You could hear them on the intercom. The pilot's steady voice calling out targets, the navigator's position updates, the waist gunners calling brake left, brake right, but you could not see them, and you could not reach them. The turret was a sealed environment. If something happened to you in there, the other men could not easily get to you. If you were hit alone. There were missions where I talked to no one for 3 hours except to call out fighters on my clock position. There were missions where I came back, and it was not until I climbed out of the ball and stood on the hard stand in the cold English air that I understood my hands were shaking. The body keeps its accounting separate from the mind. The mind stays busy with the work. The hands remember everything. October 14th. The official record states that the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 flying fortresses that day. Another 17 were damaged so severely they never flew again. 600 men were killed, wounded, or listed as missing in action. The loss rate was over 20% of the attacking force, double what planners had determined was sustainable. When the survivors landed, some put down at the first field they could find, some at bases not their own, some in fields and on roads when the engines finally quit. The sky over England that evening was full of aircraft that had no business still being airborne. My crew came back. I am not going to dress that fact up. I cannot tell you we came back because of something we did. The crews that didn't come back were not less skilled or less brave. The difference between a crew that came back from Schweinfurt and a crew that didn't was not quality, it was geometry. The flak burst 500 feet to your left instead of underneath you. The Focke-Wulf came through your formation and picked the aircraft next to you instead of yours. You were alive because the mathematics had briefly arranged themselves in your favor. That is the truth of it, and anyone who tells you differently is selling something. What changed after Schweinfurt? What changed visibly, in the faces and the conversations, and the way men moved around the barracks, was the relationship between the crews and the number 25. 25 missions was a complete tour. 25 missions and you went home. The Army Air Forces had set this number as the threshold because early in the war, the planners had calculated that a crew's skill and effectiveness peaked somewhere around mission 15 and began to decline as stress and fatigue accumulated. 25 was the point where keeping a man in combat was no longer worth the risk that his judgment had been eroded past the point of usefulness. What the planners had not fully accounted for was the arithmetic. In the autumn of 1943, with the kind of loss rates the 8th Air Force was experiencing, the probability of surviving 25 missions was somewhere around 35%. The men understood this. It was not a secret. The mathematics were visible in the empty chairs at the briefing tables and the empty beds in the barracks. 25 missions at a 4% loss rate per mission compounded. The number that came out the other end was not a comfortable one to look at. So the men stopped looking at the total number. You could not survive 25 missions. That was an abstraction too large for a human mind to carry around. What you could survive was the next one. This one. The one briefed for tomorrow morning. You took the tour apart into its smallest component, a single mission, and you focused on that. You did the work. You came back. Then you did it again. Mission 7, Mission 12, Mission 17. Each one was the only mission. I want to say something about the other men on my crew, because this is what the ball turret gunner story always risks leaving out. The ball was isolated by design, but isolation was not the same as being alone. Through the intercom, through the shared hours of every flight, through the particular intimacy of 10 men depending absolutely on each other for the continued fact of their lives, a bomber crew became something that is very hard to describe to anyone who wasn't one. The pilot and co-pilot up front in the greenhouse nose, the navigator and bombardier, with their charts and their northern sight, and the weight of every mission's whole purpose resting on those few seconds over the target. The flight engineer in the top turret, who could see the engines and knew when something was wrong before the gauges confirmed it. The radio operator behind him, maintaining contact with a world that felt very far away at altitude. The two waist gunners, standing at the open windows in the cold, that at altitude could reach 50 degrees below zero, maintaining their fields of fire to the sides. The tail gunner at the very back, alone in his own way, watching what was behind us. And me, below all of them, watching what was below. We were 10 separate people and one organism. When the pilot banked the aircraft on the bomb run, I felt it in the turret before he announced it on the intercom. When the aircraft took a hit, 10 men absorbed the impact simultaneously, and 10 men assessed the damage simultaneously, and 10 men made the calculations about whether we were still flying or not. When we came back and taxied to the hard stand and the engines cut and the ground crew came running to check for damage, we climbed out and stood together in the cold, and nobody said very much. There was nothing to say that 10 men standing together didn't already communicate. I lost crewmates, not my original crew. I am making no claim about that. But I knew men on other crews who did not come back. I knew them the way you know men you eat breakfast with every morning. You know how they take their coffee, and whether they write home every week, or only when they remember. You know their habits and their silences. And then they are gone, and the mechanism that the military has for processing that fact is mostly about moving forward. The mission briefed for the day after, and the one after that. The empty beds are filled quickly because there are always replacement crews coming through. You move forward because the alternative is not moving at all. In 1943, in the 8th Air Force, not moving was not a strategy that anyone around you had any use for. By early 1944, things had begun to change. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in the European theater in meaningful numbers, and for the first time, the 8th Air Force had a fighter with the range to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. The effect was not immediate, and it was not total, but it was real and you could feel it on the missions. Where before the Luftwaffe had been able to concentrate its attacks in the unescorted middle hours of a deep penetration mission, now there were silver fighters in the contrails ahead, finding the German interceptors before they reached the formation. The loss rates began to fall. Not to zero, there is no such thing as a safe altitude in a war, but to numbers that allowed a different kind of arithmetic. The tour requirement was raised to 35 missions, then to the final standard, because the math now allowed it. 35 missions at the new loss rates had roughly the same probability of survival as 25 had at the old ones. The men understood what was being done, and they were not entirely grateful for it, but they flew. That was the mathematics of it. One mission at a time, one rotation of the turret, one name entered in the record.